My daughter-in-law threatened to take my estate for her children, but her past victims united to expose her long history of scamming families. I, 68F, never thought I'd be writing this, but recent events have left me no choice but to share my story. After losing my husband 5 years ago, I've been living alone in our family home that we built together over 40 years ago. My only son lives about an hour away with his new wife and her 6 children from 2 previous marriages. The drama started last month during what was supposed to be a regular Sunday dinner at my house. These dinners had become our tradition since my son's marriage 2 years ago, though I'd noticed subtle changes in the dynamic over recent months. My daughter-in-law had been getting increasingly interested in my financial affairs, casually dropping questions about my retirement plans and making comments about how valuable the house must be in today's market. That particular Sunday, she was acting strangely throughout the meal, barely touching her food and constantly exchanging glances with my son. The tension was palpable, but I tried to keep things normal for the kids' sake. After dessert, while the children were watching TV in the living room, she cleared her throat and said we needed to have a serious family discussion. That's when everything went sideways. She pulled out a folder filled with printed documents and started talking about how unfair it was that my estate wasn't being divided equally among all the grandchildren. I sat there, completely stunned, as she laid out her detailed plans for how my property should be distributed after my death, including the house my late husband and I had worked so hard to pay off. The level of detail in her plans was disturbing. She'd already calculated potential property values, researched tax implications, and even had draft documents prepared for me to sign. She spoke about my death and the distribution of my assets as if she was discussing a business transaction, all while my son sat there nodding along like this was perfectly normal behavior. Here's the thing, I have nothing against her children. They're good kids, and I try my best to treat them well during family gatherings. I buy them birthday presents, attend their school events when invited, and include them in all family celebrations. But I'd already made arrangements years ago to leave most of my estate to my son and a significant portion to my late husband's sister, who has been battling cancer for the past decade and needs help with medical bills. I also have several charitable causes I've always planned to support. When I tried to explain this, my daughter-in-law's face turned red. But these are your grandchildren, she insisted, her voice rising. How can you favor some family members over others? My son sat there uncomfortably, occasionally muttering that we should keep an open mind about this. The way he avoided making eye contact with me spoke volumes about his involvement in this ambush. I remained calm and explained that my estate planning decisions were made after careful consideration and consultation with my financial advisor. That's when she dropped the bomb. She'd already consulted with a lawyer about challenging my will on behalf of her children, claiming I was unfairly discriminating against blended family members. The next few weeks were a nightmare. She started sending me lengthy emails filled with legal jargon and thinly veiled threats. Some days I'd wake up to find 3 or 4 messages in my inbox, each more aggressive than the last. She even had her lawyer send me a formal letter demanding that I revise my will to include provisions for all 6 of her children, claiming they had reasonable expectations of inheritance as step-grandchildren. My son's behavior during all this was particularly disappointing. Instead of standing up to his wife's increasingly aggressive demands, he kept trying to convince me to compromise by giving her children an equal share with my sister-in-law. When I refused, he started bringing up old family disputes and suggesting that I was living in the past by not embracing his new family fully. He even brought up mistakes I'd made when he was growing up, using them as emotional leverage to guilt me into reconsidering. Things got worse when they started involving other family members. My daughter-in-law began calling my relatives, telling them twisted versions of the situation, and painting me as an unreasonable old woman who was refusing to accept her new grandchildren. Some of my cousins started calling, trying to convince me to be reasonable and think about the family's future. I finally reached my breaking point when my daughter-in-law showed up unannounced at my house with her lawyer in tow, demanding to inspect the property they were planning to claim. The audacity of walking into my home with a stranger, treating my private space like some kind of real estate opportunity, made my blood boil. That's when I decided enough was enough. I contacted my own attorney, who specialized in estate law, and let him handle all further communication. What happened next left them completely blindsided. My lawyer discovered that my daughter-in-law had actually been in serious financial trouble before marrying my son. She'd filed for bankruptcy twice, and had a history of pursuing questionable legal claims against elderly relatives in her previous marriages. This wasn't just about ensuring her children's future. She had a pattern of targeting family assets. The real wake-up call came during a meeting with all parties present. My lawyer calmly explained that not only did her claims have no legal basis, but her aggressive attempts to pressure me into changing my will could potentially be considered elder abuse under state law. He also pointed out that her history of similar actions in previous relationships could establish a pattern of predatory behavior if this went to court. The look on her face when my lawyer mentioned her previous bankruptcies and legal claims was something I'll never forget. For once, she was completely silent, while my son looked like he was seeing his wife in a new light for the first time. It turned out she'd never told him about her financial history or her previous legal disputes with family members. I'm writing this now because things have escalated even further, and I need to know if I'm wrong for standing my ground. My daughter-in-law has started spreading rumors in our extended family, claiming I'm mentally unstable and being manipulated by my lawyers. She's even tried to convince some of my neighbors that I need to be evaluated for competency, all because I won't give in to her demands. Just yesterday, I received a call from Adult Protective Services, saying they'd received a concerned report about my welfare. The harassment has become so constant that I've had to install security cameras around my property and document every interaction. My once peaceful retirement has turned into a legal and emotional battlefield, and I'm starting to wonder if protecting my late husband's sister and our charitable commitments is worth this ongoing nightmare. The situation took an unexpected turn when my sister-in-law decided to visit after hearing about everything that was happening. She's been too sick to travel much these past few years, so seeing her on my doorstep that morning nearly gave me a heart attack. Despite her weakened condition from the ongoing cancer treatments, she insisted on coming to handle things personally. Her presence changed the dynamic completely. She'd always been the family's voice of reason, and even my late husband used to say she could smell nonsense from a mile away. The first thing she did was call my son and invite him over, just him, no wife, for a private conversation. I wasn't part of their discussion, but I could hear my sister-in-law's firm tone through the closed study door. She spent nearly 2 hours with him, and when they emerged, my son looked like he'd aged 10 years. His eyes were red, and he could barely look at me. Before leaving, he hugged me tightly and whispered, "I'm sorry," into my ear. Something he hadn't done since he was a teenager who'd broken my favorite vase. That evening, my phone started blowing up with messages from my daughter-in-law. Apparently, my son had gone home and finally stood up to her. He'd told her he was withdrawing his support for her lawsuit and demanded she stop harassing me. According to the messages, which grew increasingly hysterical, he'd even suggested they seek marriage counseling to address her unhealthy fixation with my estate. But instead of backing down, she doubled down. The next morning, I received notice that she'd filed for an emergency hearing, claiming my sister-in-law was manipulating me and taking advantage of my diminished capacity. She even tried to get a temporary restraining order to prevent my sister-in-law from visiting me, claiming she was after my money and turning me against my real family. My lawyer was prepared for this. In fact, he seemed almost pleased when I forwarded him the court documents. "She's just given us exactly what we needed," he said, explaining that her escalating behavior and false claims would help establish a pattern of harassment. He immediately filed a countermotion, including all the evidence we'd gathered about her previous similar actions with other families. The emergency hearing turned into a complete disaster for my daughter-in-law. Her lawyer, probably realizing what they were up against, tried to withdraw from the case just before it began. The judge, an older woman with sharp eyes and zero patience for nonsense, took one look at the documented pattern of behavior and not only dismissed my daughter-in-law's claims, but also issued a stern warning about potential consequences if the harassment continued. My son wasn't present for the hearing. He'd told me he couldn't bear to watch. But afterward, he came to my house alone, carrying a box of old family photos. We spent hours going through them together, reminiscing about his father and talking about things we hadn't discussed in years. He finally opened up about how he'd gotten involved with his current wife, revealing that she'd pursued him aggressively after learning about his inheritance prospects from my late husband's life insurance. "I was lonely," he admitted, staring at a photo of himself as a child, sitting on his father's shoulders. "After the divorce, she made me feel wanted again. She was so good at making everything seem normal at first. By the time I noticed the red flags, we were already married, and I didn't want to admit I'd made another mistake." The conversation was interrupted by a series of angry texts from his wife, demanding to know where he was. She'd apparently driven by my house and spotted his car in the driveway. Within minutes, she was pounding on my front door, screaming about how we were conspiring against her. My son had to call the police to get her to leave, and watching them escort her away while her children watched from the car was one of the most heartbreaking moments of this entire ordeal. That incident seemed to be the final straw for my son. He moved out of their house that night, taking only essential belongings. He's been staying with a friend while trying to figure out his next steps. The hardest part for him, he says, is seeing how this has affected her children. The younger ones don't understand why their stepfather suddenly moved out, and the older ones are caught in the middle, with their mother pressuring them to take her side. My daughter-in-law's response to my son leaving was to escalate her campaign against me. She started posting about our family drama on social media, twisting the story to make herself look like a victim fighting for her children's rights. She even created a crowdfunding page claiming she needed money to protect her children's inheritance from a manipulative mother-in-law. The posts gained some traction in certain online communities, and suddenly I was receiving hate messages from strangers who'd only heard her version of events. Some of these people even found my home address and started sending threatening letters. My lawyer documented everything, building an even stronger case against her. But the stress of dealing with this constant harassment was taking its toll. My sister-in-law, despite her health issues, has been my rock through all of this. She temporarily moved into my guest room, saying she needed a change of scenery for her recovery, but I know she's really there to support me. Her presence has been a blessing, especially during the nights when the anxiety keeps me awake, wondering how a simple estate planning decision turned into such a nightmare. Last week, things took another turn when my daughter-in-law's oldest child, a teenager, reached out to my son privately. Apparently, this wasn't the first time their mother had targeted family members for financial gain. The teen revealed that they'd moved several times throughout their childhood, each time following a similar pattern of their mother marrying into comfortable families and then initiating legal battles over assets. They'd been sworn to secrecy about these past events, with their mother claiming it was just looking out for their future. The revelation from my daughter-in-law's oldest child changed everything. My son immediately contacted his lawyer, who reached out to families from her previous marriages. What they uncovered was shocking. A carefully orchestrated pattern spanning over 15 years and 3 different states. In each case, she'd targeted well-off single or divorced men with established family wealth, particularly those with aging parents. She'd play the role of the perfect partner, using her children to create emotional connections with the families. Then, once married, she'd begin pushing for changes to wills and trust funds, often using the children as leverage. When faced with resistance, she'd escalate to legal threats and harassment campaigns, usually ending in either a settlement or a messy divorce once she realized she couldn't win. The most disturbing part was how she'd trained her children to help facilitate these schemes. The teenager explained how they were taught to call their step-grandparents Grammy and Grampy within weeks of meeting them, to talk about college dreams and future plans during family dinners, and to casually mention how their previous stepfamily had abandoned them. It was all part of a calculated strategy to create emotional pressure. My lawyer compiled all this information into a comprehensive report, including statements from 2 of her previous husbands who were willing to go on record. One of them, a retired teacher, broke down crying during his testimony, describing how she terrorized his elderly mother into changing her will, only to leave the family completely once she realized the estate was smaller than she'd anticipated. Armed with this evidence, we filed for a restraining order. The judge who'd handled the previous emergency hearing was even less impressed with my daughter-in-law this time around. Not only did she grant the restraining order, but she also ordered a full investigation into potential fraud charges based on the pattern of behavior across multiple states. My son was devastated by these revelations. He'd spent the past 2 years believing he was helping build a blended family, only to discover he'd been part of a practiced con. The hardest part for him wasn't even the betrayal. It was realizing how he'd enabled her attempts to pressure me, falling for her manipulation tactics despite the red flags. The situation with the children became increasingly complex. The older ones, now aware that their mother's behavior wasn't normal, were struggling with their own guilt and confusion. The teenager who'd initially reached out to us was particularly troubled, having carried the weight of these secrets for years. My son, despite everything, was determined to maintain a relationship with his stepchildren, recognizing that they were victims in their mother's schemes. Things came to a head when my daughter-in-law, faced with mounting legal pressure and the unraveling of her carefully constructed facade, made one final desperate attempt to salvage her position. She showed up at my house late one evening, this time alone and in tears, putting on a performance worthy of an Oscar. She broke down on my doorstep, claiming she'd had a spiritual awakening and realized the error of her ways. She spoke about childhood trauma, financial insecurity, and her desperate need to ensure her children's future. She begged for forgiveness and a chance to make things right, saying she'd seek therapy and make amends to all the families she'd hurt. For a moment, watching her sob and plead, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. But then I remembered the calculated way she'd tried to destroy my relationship with my son, the stress she'd put my sick sister-in-law through, and the emotional damage she'd inflicted on her own children. I calmly asked her to leave, maintaining my composure as she switched from tearful remorse to cold anger in an instant. "You'll regret this," she hissed, all pretense of reformation gone. "I'll make sure everyone knows what a heartless old witch you are." As she stormed off, I felt an odd sense of relief. At least now she was showing her true face, no more masks or manipulation. The next few weeks brought significant changes. My son filed for divorce, citing fraud and misrepresentation. The evidence we'd gathered made it clear that she'd entered the marriage under false pretenses, potentially invalidating their prenuptial agreement. She'd apparently hidden significant assets in accounts under her children's names, money that was traced back to settlements from her previous marriages. The older children, with their mother's schemes exposed, began opening up about their experiences. Family services became involved, and it was recommended that the children receive counseling to help them process their mother's actions and their unwitting role in her cons. My son, determined to be a source of stability in their lives, committed to supporting them through this transition, regardless of the outcome of the divorce. My sister-in-law's health, which had been declining before all this started, actually began to improve as the stress of the situation lifted. She joked that fighting my daughter-in-law had given her a new reason to live, though I suspect it had more to do with the experimental treatment she'd started. Either way, seeing her regain her strength has been one of the few bright spots in this otherwise dark chapter. As for me, I've made some changes too. While I'm keeping my original estate plans largely intact, I've worked with my lawyer to set up educational trusts for my daughter-in-law's children. Not because of her demands, but because these kids deserve a chance at a normal life, free from being used as pawns in their mother's schemes. The trusts are structured so that she can't access the funds, with my son serving as co-trustee to ensure the money is used solely for education and legitimate expenses. The community that had initially turned against me based on my daughter-in-law's social media campaign gradually learned the truth. Her crowdfunding page was shut down after multiple complaints, and several of her online supporters publicly apologized after learning about her history of similar schemes. Some even reached out to her previous victims, creating an unexpected support network for families who'd been through similar experiences. Last week, I received an unexpected letter from my daughter-in-law's second ex-husband. He explained how she'd pulled the same tactics with his family, eventually driving a wedge between him and his parents that took years to repair. He thanked me for standing my ground and exposing her pattern of behavior, saying it had given him closure he didn't know he needed. My son is slowly rebuilding his life. He's in therapy, working through the manipulation and betrayal. He spends a lot of time at my house now, often bringing his stepchildren when they want to visit. We're all learning how to be a different kind of family, one built on honesty and genuine care rather than schemes and manipulation. The legal proceedings are ongoing, but my daughter-in-law's power to hurt us is largely broken. Her history of similar cases has made it nearly impossible for her to find lawyers willing to pursue new claims, and the restraining order keeps her from continuing her harassment campaign. She's reportedly already moved to another state, presumably in search of her next target, though the documentation of her pattern of behavior will hopefully make it harder for her to succeed. Looking back, I realized that standing firm on my estate plans wasn't just about protecting my assets or my late husband's wishes. It was about refusing to be manipulated and exposing a pattern of predatory behavior that had hurt multiple families. While the process has been painful, it's led to healing and truth that might never have come to light otherwise. My sister-in-law says I should write a book about all this, turn it into a cautionary tale about protecting vulnerable families from predatory relationships. Maybe I will, once the legal dust settles. For now, I'm focused on helping my son and his stepchildren heal, maintaining the home my husband and I built together, and enjoying the peaceful retirement I'd originally planned. Sometimes standing your ground, even when it seems easier to give in, is the best way to protect not just yourself but others who might become future targets.